So you're originally from Britain, but you're currently in Italy. Why is that?
Precisely. So I'm, as you said, from the UK and from Yorkshire. Currently in Italy, where I've been since September. The main reason for that is that I've always studied languages at school, at university, and have been fascinated by languages, literature, sort of art of Italy and France in particular. So after I finished university and my master's, I decided before jump starting my career, I would take a year out in Italy. But I did in fact work. I worked as a teacher this year. So I suppose from that point of view, you would say it's not a year out, but the sort of low commitment hours. And I've just enjoyed living in this sort of country that I've always adored, meeting plenty of Italians, plenty of people from all over the world, actually. And I think it was just a sort of decision to, rather than rushing into life, sort of full guns blazing, deciding to take a little step back or sort of pause for a moment and reflect on what I want to do. And this year was sort of a good opportunity to do that. I know that I'm sort of an Italophile. I'm obsessed with Italy, so I thought, well, that's a good space to do it for that year.
So from deciding to do a year abroad to now, has your viewpoints on anything changed, even personally, of the trajectory of your life ahead?
Yeah, I think this decision to take the year out has made me realize that we don't need to go at a million miles an hour. I think it's very common for people in their 20s and even 30s to have these sort of so-called quarter life crises. And I know that I've been guilty of that plenty of times and still am. I won't pretend that that doesn't happen every now and again. But I think what I've learned from this period is that you can just accept it. You can accept that you don't need to be at the height of your success when you're 25, 26, 27. And I think another point of that is coming to understand what success even means. Maybe this is a generalization, but I think in England, especially if you come out of the university system, you're sort of trained to believe that you need to go into a successful career very quickly after university, which if you can succeed in doing so and you enjoy it, that's great. And I'm not sort of complaining about anybody who does that. It works for some. But in Italy, I've learned that most people don't start their careers until they're about 28. You know, a lot of people will go to university, do a 2 year master's, maybe even do a PhD, and stay at home for a lot of it. And there's just a far slower pace to life. And whilst that might mean that you're not potentially as financially stable as some British people might be at the age of 28, you might have learned other things that you wouldn't otherwise learn, appreciation of family, which I think is a core value in a lot of sort of Italian homes. It's the same in a lot of other homes, even in the UK. But I think it's all too easy to forget about these things. And this year's really taught me to appreciate the here and now in a way that can be quite hard to do, not only in Britain, but also just when you're living in your norm, in your sort of day-to-day life, the one that you're used to. You can sort of take things for granted, but sort of stepping outside of your comfort bubble in a way is a good way to actually appreciate what you have.
I was reading about the Mediterranean diet, which everyone espouses to be the best. And, it's the fish, it's the that. And people were saying, well, hold on, take a step back, actually. Look what the Mediterraneans do. The meals in which they have are longer.
Yeah.
And the meals that they have always have family around.
Always.
So there's this deliberate slowing down of the day. And then there's also the community and the family element.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something that I've definitely noticed is family being a core part of the day-to-day life, slow living, and hospitality and conviviality. I mean, the friends that I've made here in Turin, their families always invite me for meals. And it's never a case of, come on over and we'll just make a bit of spaghetti, whatever. It's an elaborate affair, not fancy in terms of it's not some sort of fine dining experience, but it's long, it's slow, it's loud, and the food is it's very loud. The food is sort of the side show to the rest of it. It's not so much about what you're eating, but how you're doing so. And I think that's something that, again, we can forget to do. It's really easy to just sort of whack the TV on, make a meal very quickly in the microwave and sit down on the sofa and eat. But that's inconceivable over here. I mean, forget all the sort of things about Italians getting upset about pineapple on pizza and all the rest. They do get upset by that, but the main important, very much so. The main important thing is definitely being there together and just taking it slowly. A lot of people may have heard of it, but the lovely saying "il dolce far niente," the Italian way of living, is just sort of, and again, it's a stereotype, but stereotypes come from truth. And I've just noticed that even if it's not the same for everyone in Italy, from my point of view, I have just felt very calm this year because of the pace of life. And I can say that for the other, I suppose you'd call them expats who are over here, who have been living in Italy for some time. When you speak to them, they just feel calm. You might feel the same way in France. I know France and Italy have differences, but they also have similarities. And one of them is maybe that not everything has to go at a million miles an hour.
So in Britain, if we compare Britain and Italy, what you're saying there, then a family aspect's not as central to people's lives. So two people will have children, the children will grow up, they'll go to university, and then they'll go off to separate cities and they'll see them twice a year. Family relationships, I find in the Western world, can be quite difficult. There's always the straining, or people are at their throats at different times. What then do the Italians do which is different that smooths over the inevitable cracks that come up in
Yeah.
family?
I think that's a really good question. And first of all, I'll say that there are pros and cons to both approaches. But one of the things that I think is interesting is this year, whilst teaching, I was teaching 14 to 19-year-olds. A lot of them would want to know about English life. And we would talk about university quite a lot. And they were, by and large, quite shocked that almost everybody in the UK moves away from home to go to university. It's really uncommon for somebody to, let's say, live in Leeds and want to go to Leeds University. They'll want to get either as far away from Leeds as possible, or at least go to York or Sheffield so that they're not in the same sort of town as they grew up in. But in Italy, nobody does that. Very few, at least. Most people will go to university and stay in their family home whilst they do it. Now, that's partially to do with the concepts such as funding. You know, we get a university grant or loan in the UK you can afford at that time to move away. And it's not necessarily as easy to do so in Italy. But what it does mean as a sort of side effect is that people stay at home. And after you've stayed at home until the age of 28, you're just so used to it. Why would you move elsewhere? You've got your family, inviting you around for dinners all the time. It's easy, it's comfortable. And I think, as you said and alluded to, in the UK, maybe people go home for Christmas, maybe for one other occasion, maybe for a wedding, something along those lines. But it's not quite as common to stay at home. People are drawn to the city, people are drawn elsewhere, and family is something that's nonetheless important, but it's not the most important part of a person's future. Whereas I think there's a stereotype as well in Italy of this idea of il mammone, the sort of mummy's boy. And it's quite true. One of my best friends here, he's 29 and he's living at home. In the UK, you might think, gosh, what's that all about? Why have you chosen to leave? Whereas for him, until he finds his financial stability and independence, he's quite happy living at home, where he's got his parents to, live with. And it's not because he needs them to cook for them. He's able to cook, but it's because he enjoys it. And I think that's a slight difference. In the UK, I don't think many people would enjoy staying at home for all that long and being denied their freedoms that we learn at university. But if you've not learned that freedom at university, you're probably not going to be aware that you're lacking it.
If we were to delve deeper into it, we have the American dream, which is very entrepreneurial, make as much money as possible. And the British dream is probably a bit less, maybe go to a good university, get a graduate job, make 30 grand and, try and get into the three figures maybe by the time you're 45. So then what would be the Italian dream?
That's a really good question, because from the sort of get-go, I don't think there's necessarily the same possibility to do the graduate schemes, 30k a year, follow on, try and get your big salaries in your 40s. In Italy, the idea of a graduate scheme doesn't really exist as much. And I think because of that, the dream is slightly different. But I think going back to what we've already mentioned, and it's sort of the buzzword here, is probably family and having a stable, comfortable life where you are able to live with those you love. Again, could be a generalization. There will be a lot of Italians in cities like Milan and potentially Rome who are very financially driven. I'm not saying that Italians aren't financially driven, but I think there's more of a desire to live than there is in the UK, let's say. And if you go to a city such as Naples, I think you'll never be in a city that's more lively. And I mean lively in the sense of both the ambiance and the sounds, but also in the sense that people are really just living. They're not too bothered about things of trivial importance. They're very interested in just living each day peacefully, or maybe not so peacefully, but just living each day and seizing each day. And that's not to say seizing the day by going and doing all the most incredible things in the world, but it's just enjoying the simple things. You know, the aperitif at 6 or 7 p.m., the coffee in the morning. You know, I think ritual and habit comes into it quite a lot. I think a lot of the Italians I've met profess to being creatures of habit. And I think that's part of the dream, is just finding what you like and living by it. I suppose it will change generation by generation, but one of the very common things is the ability to stay near your family, to have them look after you and you to look after them. It may come from, you know, the Catholicism that's quite rife in the history of Italy, but it comes from all sorts of other things too. But I think that, to answer your question, yeah, whilst you can very clearly label the American dream and probably to the same extent the British dream, the Italian dream, I think, at least from an external point of view, is a very romanticized one. And its romanticization comes from the fact that it's very simple. And that's not to say that Italians are simple people, but it's to say that it's more achievable to live a peaceful life here, even if it's a very frantic country.
So in the 17th to 19th century, young, mostly aristocratic young men would go across and do a grand tour of France and Italy, experience the culture, the art and the music firsthand, which they couldn't have done back in England. Do you feel as though you're on your own modern grand tour?
That's a really nice question, actually. And to a certain extent, yes, I would say so. Key differences, I suppose, are that back then you're sort of living off the money from your family that they were sending, and you'd have a tour guide, so to speak, who would be going around with you, sort of giving you all the knowledge about Italy and teaching you. But that aside, I would say yes, in many ways. I'm over here traveling the country as and when I can and meeting people and sort of enriching myself through literature, art, architecture, the language itself. And yeah, I would say, even if it may not be grand in the sense of an opulent lifestyle, I'm not sort of spending excessive amounts of money to be here and all the rest. But in terms of the tour itself and the important sort of life lessons you gain from a grand tour, I'd certainly say so. I've been very lucky to be able to visit many cities in Italy over the course of my life, including this year, and sort of expose myself to beautiful, beautiful pieces of art and learn literature from friends and things like that. I would definitely say that I've been on a grand tour this year. And I think that anybody who can get the chance to do something of the sort, even if it's not a year long, even if it's 2 weeks or a week in a country where you, rather than just treating yourself as a normal 21st century tourist, try to go into the sort of 17th century, 18th century mindset of engaging with the culture, I think it's a really great way to open your mind. Engaging with history is such a key way of understanding yourself. I mean, if I read the travel writing from people like Charles Dickens as an example, who came to Italy, or if I read Lord Byron's poetry, it may differ in tone to how I may write it myself, but the key themes are very much the same. This sort of awe and excitement of seeing these things that you don't see day to day walking around London or York, or any other city in the UK, which are beautiful cities in their own right. It's so exciting to be able to go and see something from a totally different culture, even though as Europeans, you know, we share a lot in common historically with Italians, French, you know, Spanish, you name it. Italy and the other countries, they just have such rich histories which do differ from our own. And the beautiful thing about Italy in particular is that each region is distinctly different. I mean, Italy wasn't unified until the 1860s. And so you just have regions which are so totally different. If you were to try and compare Naples to Milan, things that keep it in common are the language. And even the language isn't that similar, because people in Naples speak the Neapolitan dialect. And if you were to go to Sardinia, people would say that they're Sardinian, not Italian. You know, it's incredible as a country because everywhere you go, you're you're seeing a completely different culture. There may, as I say, be comparisons to be drawn, but actually it's not like the counties in the UK, which are somewhat random in many ways. In Italy, the regions are very distinctive, and that in itself is wonderful. It makes for a sort of historical tour wherever you want to do one. There's not going to be a region that is uninteresting.
You espouse the merits there of slowing down, taking things in, the Italian approach to life. But it could be argued that that's a slippery slope down to idleness. And especially in the Western world, we have come to the realization that we can never really escape the burden of Genesis 1, that we must work.
Yeah.
And we've sort of come to the realization that good, honest, hard work is as important to humanity as morality itself.
Yeah.
So how do you, having experienced both sides, reconcile the two worlds?
I think that's a very good question as well. And part of, when I was talking about this sort of quarter life crisis earlier, is part of that for me is, how do I work out how to live a life of relaxation whilst also doing my bit for myself, for my community, for society as a sort of wider concept? And I don't know if you've read or watched The Talented Mr. Ripley. There's a character played by Jude Law, Dickie Greenleaf, who...
It's quite funny because, so this is a completely different podcast to my last one with this fashion designer. And the fashion designer alluded to Dickie Greenleaf.
Greenleaf, yeah.
So he comes up all the time.
You're not going to miss him. And he's played wonderfully by Jude Law. So anybody who wants to watch that, you can get some good inspiration for sartorial elegance. But one of the things that Dickie Greenleaf does is he just lives a very lazy life with a lot of maybe immoral womanizing involved too, which you'll come to see if you read or watch it. But he's living off his trust fund. Now, whilst that might look elegant and beautiful, and you think, crikey, what a life he's living, you do also have to ask yourself, well, and what more? And I think that's the thing that I've been asking. Whilst it would be beautiful to live a life just like that, there would surely come a day where you think, well, what's the point? If you have that every day, maybe it makes it less enjoyable when you just take it for granted. So I think one of the things that I want to work out, and I think I can speak for a lot of young people when I say this, is how to find the balance between work life and life. And I think for me, time is the most important currency, more so than, the Great British Pound or something like that. Is I'd love to have the time to do what I want, but you need to work out what you can do with that time if you're not working. I, this year, was working as a teacher. As I said, it wasn't a huge hourly commitment weekly, but it was enough to give me a responsibility. It was enough for me to feel that I was doing something worth doing, helping people. I enjoyed myself doing it as well. And I think you have to sort of find a way to work to enjoy the leisure. If it's just leisure, I just wonder if you could get bored of it because it's not special anymore, Now, it's easy when you're really stressed with work to look at people who are, on a beach in, Mauritius or something like that and think, gosh, how wonderful. And it is probably for them if it's ephemeral and they're not doing it forever. But if it's all you ever do, you're probably going to start getting a bit envious of the people who have some form of responsibility, because it's not just about the idea of making money. And this is all in my mind, at least. It's not just about the idea of making money and, being financially stable. I think it's also doing something for yourself, because if you do just sit and do nothing, you're not necessarily realizing your full potential. I don't know what work, it all comes down to the individual. Now, work could be going and working in a bank and feeling like you're doing something good. It could be writing a novel and feeling that you're doing something good. But I think as long as you're doing something somewhat productive for yourself, that's really important, just so that you don't become bone idle, because that's no good for you. Forget wider society. I think it's just not great for you to live a life of nothingness, because boredom slips in and you probably look for a new excitement. Since I finished teaching, actually, I've had 2 months now before I start whatever comes next. And I think it is really important to try and keep yourself busy, even if, as I say, that's writing or painting or taking up a sport or something like that. You might say sport isn't a form of work, sure, if you're not being paid for it. But I don't think I'm talking about payment here and salary. I think it's about doing something just to make sure that you're not doing nothing, that you're not becoming a sloth.
Because if we certainly look in the creative industries, then that sort of space that you need to conceptualize ideas and then put them either onto paper or to paint, whatever, that then leads to a lot of time, which can lead to idleness, but it
Yeah.
also can make you quite a miserable person. Like if we look at the Parisian writers like Hemingway, etc., like
Yeah.
creative geniuses, like the work in which they did was amazing. But they're all pretty nasty characters on the personal level.
Yeah, I think there's definitely that to consider. I mean, you look at the Lost Generation, as you just mentioned, with Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Zelda, Gertrude Stein. They created some wonderful pieces which have, changed literature, but they were pretty depressive or violent or aggressive and probably not the nicest people to hang around with. You then maybe think about Baudelaire, who was writing poetry in his attic in Paris. And if you read it, it's really just, it's full of melancholy, and it's not actually probably desirable to be somebody like him. As wonderful as his output was, and as grateful as I think society is to have had him exist. Do you envy him? Would you like to be him? Probably not, because he wasn't a very happy chap. And I think, yeah, you make a very good point there that productivity doesn't always lead to sort of positivity. And I think for me, it's finding whatever I do in the future, it's finding something that I do that will at least satisfy me, either scratches an itch or that challenges me. I think challenge is a big part, because I know a lot of people who are working jobs that they're good at, they get paid well for, but they complain that they're not doing anything that actually challenges them, and that becomes monotonous. And that makes, it's not that they don't want to go to work because they don't like work or they're not good at it. They don't want to go to work because they feel that they're pretty useless, or that a chimpanzee could do what they're doing. And I suppose, unfortunately, that's the reality for a lot of people in the world. But if you can find a way to create a career that you enjoy, or that at least you don't dislike, and you can also find time to connect with your passions, that's the ideal situation. And I think it's really important to find, we always talk about that work-life balance, and we also talk about, work hard, play hard. It's about finding whatever's right for you. Once you close that laptop and finish work, or once you put the pen down and stop creating your, wonderful novel that's going to change the world, you need to find that distraction that isn't work, whatever that may be. And I think one of the things that, going back to Italy, I've appreciated this year is that when people finish work, they just seem to stop talking about it. They go to the cafe, have their Aperol, and they just talk about life. And I think that's something that we in the UK could learn a few lessons from, is, not going to the pub after work and talking about work. The ability to just disconnect is something that I think is very enviable. And I think something that from this year I would sort of strive towards, whatever I end up doing in the future, is just being able to find that way to not let my work life affect my day-to-day life. Because actually, one of my friends was talking to me recently about the fact that our daily life is our life. What we do on a day-to-day basis is how we actually live our life. And as obvious as that may seem, I think it's quite striking, because you can very easily forget that that's the case. If you are wanting to be the next Ernest Hemingway and create a brilliant novel, forget him as a person, but you're not each day sitting down to write, then are you actually a writer, or are you just a wannabe writer? If you, feel that you're the kind of person who wants to go on long walks and enjoy nature, then you've got to do that. And if your day-to-day life is something that you're not happy with, then unfortunately it tends to mean that your actual life is such, and you can make these changes. And it doesn't require moving out to Italy or France or anything like that. But it just requires maybe a bit of self-awareness that can be quite hard to connect with, following the British education system as an example, where you're just sort of put on a conveyor belt and told to, do what everybody else is doing. And I'm not saying that there's anything inherently wrong about that if that's what you like doing, but I think it's very important for everybody to stop for a second and actually question, is this what I like doing? Am I happy doing this? And if you are, that's great. And if you're not, what can you do differently?
Do you find these meta questions that you're asking yourself as a result of what you're reading and exposing yourself to in books and art, and especially in Italy? Or is it the time in which you've given yourself to think about the issues that you're exploring them?
I think both. I think I'm maybe inherently the kind of person who likes to think about these sort of questions. And as a result of that, probably choose books that might help me answer them, thinking, oh, I'll pick up this book because it will give me the answers. And usually they actually end up opening more questions and giving answers. And you can sort of spiral like that. But and it's all too easy. I've got friends who chose to do philosophy at university to get the answers, and now they're more confused than they were before they started. But I think you're right. I think some of the things that I end up reading do open up these ideas that you wouldn't necessarily consider otherwise. And actually, one of the writers that I've really enjoyed reading lately is Paul Auster, who recently passed away. A lot of his books, we always talk about the classics, and we mention the writers that we've already mentioned from the Lost Generation. We mention Charles Dickens. We mention, Bronte and the like, people who are the classics. But it's not so common that people talk about the modern classics and people who are still alive or have just recently passed away. And I think we can put Paul Auster into this category because he deals with contemporary topics, or if not contemporary, universal topics that have always maybe plagued mankind, ideas of loneliness or fatherly betrayal. For him, he seemed to have a lot of problems with his father that some people do. Or things like love, topics which are very universal. And I think that's what makes him, in my opinion, a modern classic writer, because he asks these questions and he answers them well, and he does so in novel form. It's not a philosophical treatise. And I think I'm not telling everybody to go and buy the next, Paul Auster book they see in the shop, but more to also consider reading contemporary writers, because they can answer the questions, and sometimes they can do so better than the classics. I love the classics, but I think it's also important to find those writers who are maybe touching on topics that we today have that we didn't used to. I mean, I haven't read many books on topics such as AI, but you're not going to find all the answers to that necessarily in books by, Shelley. You might. There are, in fact, Frankenstein and AI could have quite a lot in common. You could definitely draw the links there. But all I'm saying here is you should read the classics because they do give answers for today's problems. You shouldn't snub writers who are currently writing. And it's all too easy to do so because it's not as romantic to think about these writers. You can't glamorize their past. But I've definitely found that since I started reading writers who are still alive, it's maybe been more insightful than I thought it would have been.
A new thing which I have started to do when choosing my next books is choose local authors to the region in which I'm in. Because what that allows me to do is allow me to resonate with the words on the page in a deeper level, because I relate to the places and the people with whom they're talking about. And it could be in any different topic or form or format, but there's a deeper resonance there. And so I'm on like 3 or 4 like local books just from my region of Scotland in which I'm from. And I'm just really enjoying it.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good way to approach reading. And actually, I funnily enough, started doing that recently too. I don't really know why, I just did. And it's a great way to, as you say, maybe think about the places that you know in a way that you've never necessarily put into words yourself, but have existed in your mind. It sort of vocalizes it for you. I've picked up quite a few books by a writer called Pavese. In fact, I've got his poetry right here, and he's local to Turin. He isn't alive any longer. He was a 20th century writer. But when you're reading his descriptions of the city, you end up just nodding along and thinking, yeah, I didn't think about that. Or maybe you nod along and think, yeah, that's it. You hit the nail on the head there. And I think reading writers who are local, even if they're not immensely famous, I mean, in Italy, Pavese is a very famous name, but even if you pick up, let's say I'm from Yorkshire and I pick up a piece by James Herriot, All Creatures Great and Small, or something like that, he's not got world-renowned fame, but he's very well known, can't deny that. But when you're reading it, it does make you feel something about your home that you wouldn't necessarily have thought to feel otherwise. I think I would recommend that to anyone too. James Herriot has helped me understand Yorkshire in a way that I didn't necessarily know I needed to. And you might have that with the Scottish writers you've been reading. It's very it's sort of a beautiful experience, actually. I think that's the best way to put it.
I think anyone who's embarked on the journey with James Herriot has finished the book or the series feeling like a Yorkshire person themselves.
Yes, exactly. And that's when you've got a successful writer, is when you can feel that way. Definitely. Yeah.
What's your thoughts on fiction versus non-fiction as an overall premise? So my sister is a English teacher, and she's
Okay.
constantly dealing on a daily basis words, sentences, the structural elements to the English language. And so when she sits down and reads, she just wants to be entertained. So
Yeah.
I always mock her, like since we were like 13, that every book that she reads has a dragon on the cover.
Yeah.
Because she's dealing with all of the classics on a daily
Yeah.
basis. Whereas I'm very much to the side, so I'm like very rarely delve into fiction. We have the thing, she wants to be entertained, I want to be informed. So I just love biographies, historical biographies specifically.
Yeah.
So what do you think, certainly from a creative romantic point of view, of the perfect balance which people should strike? And obviously it's very personal, but if you were to describe a balance between the two, how would you formulate that?
Yeah, I mean, as you said, it's very personal, but for me at least, I mean, at the moment, I definitely read far more fiction than I do non-fiction when I'm actually talking about holding a book in hand. But I do consume a heck of a lot of non-fiction on a day-to-day basis too, and I think I would really struggle to live my days without non-fiction. Even if I'm not reading it in sort of paper form, I might be reading it by scrolling through an article online, or by downloading a PDF of an academic article, or reading about the history of whatever battle it may be. I think, like you, I do love to be informed, and I think we need to be informed anyway. I also think having an understanding of non-fiction helps you appreciate fiction better, because the greatest writers were the ones, or are the ones still, who understand the world. To be able to touch people's emotions and convey images correctly, you have to know the world. And to know the world, a lot of these writers are pretty good historians or geographers or things such as that. Maybe very good in STEM. If you're reading Dan Brown, for example, he knows a lot about all sorts of things that definitely come into scientific matters or technological advancements and things like that. To really appreciate fiction, I think you have to understand non-fiction. Now, how to give a good balance, that's a hard one to say. I think bedtime reading, it might be nice to do some fiction just so that you're not having to think too hard, a bit like what your sister's sort of alluding to. But if you're just wanting to read a book to, I don't know, pass away the train journey, maybe read a book about something that you're interested in. I think the important thing would be, if you're picking up non-fiction, is to try and pick one up that you are actually interested in. Don't try and pick one up to try and force an interest. If you're not remotely interested in artificial intelligence, it's probably not worth picking up a book about artificial intelligence, because you probably just won't finish it. But if you, let's say, instead have a real strong interest in the Tudors and pick up John Guy's books about the Tudor history and the Tudor family, it's probably a really good way to approach a car journey or something like that. And you can gain a lot from it. I would say, yeah, it's really important to get a mix. It doesn't necessarily have to be a 50-50 split. I think it also depends on the way your brain works. If you can't go to sleep, if you've got too much information in your head, then read a book with dragons in it, or a book that, or a book that very little happens, or it's just calming. But if you can go to bed and, after having read a biography of Donald Trump or something like that, then go for it. It's really personal, but I think the main thing is that you choose what interests you. There's no point following trends just for the sake of it. That goes for fiction, where a lot of people follow book talk and just choose the books that have been told to read, really struggle to get through it, and don't know why they didn't enjoy it, and say they don't like reading. You don't, in that case, you don't like reading because you're reading the wrong books. And that's the same for non-fiction. If you're picking up non-fiction books about something that just doesn't interest you, you're not going to finish it. And if you do, you've probably not absorbed the information. So I think more so than giving a 50-50 or 70-30 split, it's about choosing the ones that are just going to interest you and engage you.
Yeah, it's interesting. I had a sort of epiphany, as it were, in the 2019 general election. So I was
Yeah,
very much in politics at the time. I was 20 years old, so you know
yeah,
everything when you're 20 years old. So I was
of course.
basically, I could decipher all of the news, and I was consumed by the election.
Yeah,
I didn't necessarily, I wasn't swayed one way or another. I just
no,
loved the realpolitik of it all,
yeah,
and I was reading like 6 hours a day, like of news articles, Twitter threads, etc. I was
yeah,
just getting so consumed in it. And I realized, I thought, all of this stuff in which I'm reading about, it'll be here today and then gone tomorrow. This whole scandal or this bill in which they're proposing, it's going to be irrelevant in like 4 days. And I've just invested 4 or 5 hours of my time reading about the minute details of it all. I could have
yeah,
invested that into an Austen novel, and
yeah.
the knowledge in which I would have had, or the take, or even the enjoyment, would have lasted for years rather than like a mere day.
Yeah, I think that's a really strong point. I think one of the reasons I do sway towards fiction is because I better retain the information when it's from fiction because it's more likely if you want to touch your soul, so to speak, whereas nonfiction isn't going to. And something that touches your soul can probably stay with you a lot longer. I often find myself, if somebody's saying something and it triggers a memory of a book that I read 4 years ago, and it sort of pops up. I don't think I necessarily have that after reading nonfiction. That's not to say that it's not important, as we've both said, it is. But I think there's something timeless about literature that makes it so enjoyable. Now, I know a lot of people, very intelligent people too, who really don't know where to begin with reading. They say that they've tried picking up a book, but they just don't enjoy it, and they'd rather either sit and watch Netflix or just do nothing or sit on their phone. Now, I think that's because nowadays we can consume information and entertainment in many, many ways. In the past, obviously, literature was far more prevalent in the sort of literate circles because it was one of the few accessible pieces of entertainment. And I would implore people to read if they get the chance to. But I do think it should be said that we shouldn't scorn people who have immense knowledge of cinema or TV series or things like that, because as there are so many trashy novels, there are so many trashy shows, but as there are so many brilliant novels, there are so many brilliant shows and movies. And I know people who are studying film studies to a PhD level who are really diving into the human condition when doing so. And I think it's all too easy to say that sitting in front of a TV screen is a lazy thing to do, but actually you can gain so much from it. And I think going back to what you said about remembering information from reading a novel compared to reading a news article or something like that, you can say the same for movies. You can have really academic conversations actually about something like Taxi Driver if you want to. So I think as long as people are entertained and as long as it's an entertainment that they actually do gain satisfaction from, then it doesn't really matter where it comes from. I think novels maybe are always going to be something that contain deep information because of the very fact that a writer tends to be a very deep-minded person. So the novel form is always going to be full of existential questions, but you can also gain the same from watching TV shows and movies, in my opinion.
Although I think as a society, we subconsciously believe that the message is in the medium. So if we take,
Mm.
for example, a reel, an Instagram reel, there's a no
Yeah,
commitment. You sit there, you can flick on at any time, you can flick off.
yeah,
And that's a sliding scale down to a movie, which you don't really need to even concentrate in if you
yeah,
want to. But if you sit down and read War and Peace, you're going to be there for about 60 hours, depending on how
yeah,
you. I agree completely that the lessons that you can glean from TV
yeah,
and movies, etc. But we always think subconsciously that something that you really need to invest in, like a War and Peace or something like that, then
yeah.
holds more value, surely because of the investment required in order to obtain it.
Yeah, and I think that's a very good point. And I think it comes down to how you read or how you watch. If you're a conscientious reader or watcher of something, I could sit and read War and Peace now and not take in any of the information and just do it to go from A to B, to finish the book and say, look, I've finished it, put it on Goodreads and, be happy about that. Or I could sit down with a pen and really try to understand the messages that are being shared with me. And I could do that with a movie. I could sit and watch, any movie and just think, oh, it's just passing the time. Or I could sit and really analyze what the director or the screenwriter or the scriptwriter have really wanted to say. So I think probably because anybody who's usually, unless it's with this new potentially craze of wanting to just read as many books as you can in a year, for most readers, if you're picking up a book, you're putting effort into it. There are very few people who read just like without actually absorbing the information. It does just come in whether you like it or not. So I think that's true what you say. Reading is more of an active effort. And I think that's why we believe that. I think you can actively watch a film, but it's definitely a rarer pursuit.
I was discussing with a friend recently, and it's interesting you were saying you have a pen, as you could have a pen as you go through something to sort of glean as much as possible. For some reason, I've always felt this as sacrilege to write in a book. So my friend basically destroys the book if he finds it interesting. Pen, highlighter, in the margins, etc. And I like to put little post-it notes, like arrow post-it notes on a point or something. And we were having a big doodah about it, like who got the best method. He was talking about, he likes to pontificate about Kant sometimes. So he picked up Kant to show me what he was referencing. But he couldn't find it because he'd underlined it, and he'd underlined so much of the book. So that's what you see. You need your little sticky labels, and you know exactly where you are.
Yeah. And he felt quite embarrassed after.
So you studied at both Durham and Oxford. What's the differences between those two universities?
I think, first of all, I'll maybe mention that the similarities, which will then help to answer the differences. The similarities are that they're both collegiate universities. So that means that the easiest way to summarize it is that, like in Harry Potter, you've got houses. In these universities, you've got colleges where your social life is, you live in your college, you eat in your college is your house, so to speak. Now, Durham's obviously modelled off Oxford in that sense, but they've got that in common. And it means that your social life is very accessible because you just meet people without even trying. And there's a lot of formal traditions, such as formal dinners where you wear a gown and a suit and sort of go and have a meal at a long table in a pretty grand hall. So those are some of the similarities. The differences, I would say, it depends how you're approaching it. I think the way in which the undergraduate system, at least, is run. Now, I did undergraduate at Durham and postgraduate at Oxford, so I can speak better for Durham, but I can, from what I observed, say what happens at Oxford for undergraduates is Durham undergraduates probably have more time to have fun. So there's more of a work-life balance. You can work hard and get a good degree from a very good university, but also do a lot of sport or a lot of music or going out to bars with your friends without too much concern about what that will mean, because you're assessed each and every year and it's sort of weighted. Your first year doesn't count, your second year is 40%, and your final year is 60%. So there's less pressure insofar as it's all drawn out. Whereas in Oxford, for the undergraduates, it all comes down to your final exams. It's not coursework, it's final exams, maybe with a bit of coursework scattered here and there. And it means that the pressure comes down to exam week. And I think that's just immensely stressful. Fortunately for me in my postgraduate, the method of assessment was essays, not exams. And that suits me very well. But I think the main difference would just be stress and time. Oxford students at undergraduate just don't have the time necessarily to enjoy the university experience quite as much as other universities allow people to do so. That's not to say they don't enjoy themselves, they definitely do, but the enjoyment comes with a bit of a sacrifice. You're then stressed the next day, and I don't necessarily think that I felt quite as stressed at Durham as I would have done as an undergraduate at Oxford. From my point of view, I'm very glad that I had the opportunity to do it the way I did. Undergraduate at Durham, where I could have fun and get a good degree, and then a master's at Oxford where I could also have fun, because I think master's level is less stressful. You've already got a degree behind you, so you don't have to worry about that. And you've spent 3 or 4 years already learning how to do it. So you're a bit more set. I think for anybody who's wanting to do a master's, whether it be at Oxford or elsewhere, I would say if you have the time and you find funding to do so, go for it because it is a really exciting opportunity. If you can do it in a subject that you love, that's even better. But if you have to do it for a subject that might help your career, go for that too, because an extra year of being a student is no bad thing. It just gives you that time to learn about yourself a little bit better.
Did you find the teaching which you received at Oxford to be superior to that of Durham, or is it the prestige that the university has mostly down to the high entrance exams and barrier to entry? It creates sort of litmus tests for elite effectively, and then it
Yeah.
has that aura, or is the teaching that much better?
So I would say that, okay, first thing first, the professors I had at Oxford were wonderful. They were incredible. They were at the top of their field and they were great. But so were the professors I had at Durham. And I would say that that can be said for almost every university in the country. To be a professor at university level, you're the top of your game. You're the expert in your field, whether that's Oxford, Lancaster, Bristol, Essex, you name every university in the country, the professors will be incredible. So I don't think it necessarily comes down to the standard of teaching by the professor. It maybe comes down to the mode in which the university asks for it to be done. At Oxford, you have tutorials where you're with a professor and maybe one or two other students. So you've got a lot of direct focus. At Durham, you have seminars of maybe 10 to 20, sometimes even more students, usually 10 to 20. So if you were to take this professor who's giving the seminar to 20 people and put them in an Oxford environment, you would gain just as much from them as you would from the Oxford professor. It's more about the focus on you as an individual that really helps. And I think that's what sets the Oxbridge experience apart and gives it its elite sort of aura, is because of the fact that you're getting so much attention from a world leading expert. Whereas at other universities, you've still got a world leading expert, but not putting all of their attention into you and one other person. I think that's probably the main difference. The libraries at somewhere like Oxford just have so much more funding that you do have a lot of access to whatever you want. And if you need a book, the library can afford to buy that book for you. So there is that, which makes studying a lot easier because you know that you've got basically unrivaled access to any information you want.
So, what was it that you were studying at Durham, and then what did you go on to do at Oxford as well?
So I did, officially the degree title was Modern Languages and Cultures at Durham. So that was for me Italian and French. Now within that, each year you'll do 6 modules. 2 of those modules will be language, so Italian and French, and 4 will be what they called cultural modules, which by and large is literature, but you can tailor it to also be art history or philosophy or something, as long as it's related to the language or the, linguistic area that you're studying. So if you're studying French, it's anywhere in the Francophone world. You could be doing French literature, or you could be doing literature from parts of the Caribbean. But it means that the degree was largely literature, art history, philosophy based, but with language components. And then at Oxford, I carried on with just Italian, but you didn't do languages at that point because they assumed that having done the undergraduate, you've got the language. And having done a year abroad on your undergraduate degree, you should. And that's also in itself a great opportunity. And I then went at Oxford, studied basically Italian art history and literature in tandem with one another. So a lot of my focus of my thesis was to do with artistic representations of a certain canto from Dante's Inferno. So like putting literature and art in dialogue with one another was my main focus, really.
And just finally, Robin, as we come to a close, you are a big advocate for opera. And
Yeah.
I had my operatic debut this summer. It was in a walled garden, of all places. What is it about opera in which you see so much value and would prescribe for other people to join in with you?
Yeah, I think that's definitely worth considering because I think I went to my first opera when I was 18, but that wasn't of my own choice. That was, I got given a ticket for a birthday from a relative, and so I went, not really knowing what to expect. I've always liked the music from operas. There's some really distinctive ones that when they come on, everybody can feel something because of the beauty of the sound. But I didn't really know what to expect. I didn't know if I would enjoy the fact that it's singing the whole time and no normal dialogue. And then since then, I was sort of fell in love with the medium, and I've been to quite a few. I think something that I just find so wonderful about it is that for those few hours when you're in there, you're experiencing an auditory experience that is just unrivaled. The talent that these singers have is just insane. Their ability to use their lungs to, and diaphragm in such a way that the sound travels as far as it does with such, beautiful melodies and pitch and you name it. I'm not a very musical person, so my technical terms are all off. But but what I think is, with that in mind, I think is wonderful is, as a non-musical person, I can still appreciate the beauty of it. And if you wanted to, you could sit and not read the surtitles and try to understand what's happening, which they always have by and large. Is the words translated or in the original, depending on where you are in the world, to help you understand, because you can't often hear what they're actually singing, but you could still almost understand the story just by listening to the voices and the music. I think the music speaks for itself, and that's something that it almost allows you to switch off, even though you could try and focus really hard on it. It almost allows you to switch off and just enjoy the beauty that is around you. Now, some people would go a very different way and really focus on it and really try to get to the bottom of the human condition, which a lot of opera writers, deal with. And that's beautiful too. But I think the main thing for me is that you don't need to be an expert in music, but you can go to these things and just appreciate the sheer beauty of it all.
What a message to end on. Robin, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Joe. Have a lovely, lovely day and rest of your week.